So now we're starting to get a little closer to knowing what we're supposed to do for all of the rest of the year. So far, seeing the number of views on the videos, little disappointed. Now many of you are deciding just to ignore all this. Whenever you don't get fives on the AP exam, I'll know why. But I digress. I'm actually re-recording this with less videos in it. I didn't realize how many I had left, and I think I broke YouTube because it's just simply not uploading. That many copyright issues. I guess that's what you get for combing the internet for videos. But that also means that I'm going to have things linked for you so that you can watch as it was expected to be done. So let's talk about Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam. Really the Vietnam War is contained within this lesson because this is when we think of Vietnam here in the United States, usually in terms of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, even though it would go into Richard Nixon's. And of course, we'll end the war properly under Richard Nixon. Before I go into that, a quick footnote in the change in music and culture. The British invasion, which happens in 1964, bunches of very popular British bands come to the United States and revolutionize music. Modern music does not happen with bands like the Rolling Stones and especially the Beatles. You really just cannot get around that. Everything that we appreciate in music today starts with the Beatles, and without their influence, music would be very different. All of the branches come back to rock and roll gets its primary shift beginning 1964. So I can't include it for obvious reasons. I want you to go and look at the attached clip now of the Beatles song I Want to Hold Your Hand, performed in Washington, D.C., and I want you to pay attention to the crowd. Why people freaked out so much is because of how the teenagers saw the Beatles. So pay attention to the crowd reaction throughout the video. And keep in mind that there are no euphemisms in this song. It is purely talking about wanting to hold someone's hand. It's ridiculous. So go do that, then come back. You did that? I mean, you wouldn't lie to me, right? All right, if you say so. So let's talk about Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is a Texas Democrat, and that sounds almost like a contradiction in terms at this point. It may be the exception of Beto O'Rourke, but LBJ is the opposite of Beto O'Rourke. Lyndon Baines Johnson is a strong man. He's very tall, and he's very good at using his size to make other people uncomfortable and therefore get his way. Being close and just being intimidating, those are congressmen in those photos. And that's simply what LBJ did to get his way. As a president, he was known for having cabinet meetings while on the toilet, just because everyone else would be uncomfortable and want to get out, and therefore would give him what he wanted and move on. No one would waste time. His favorite thing to do, he had an amphibious car, a car that you could drive into the water and then it would act as a boat. And he would use it on his Texas ranch for tours, but he wouldn't tell anyone that it was an amphibious car. So at one point in the ranch where there'd be a road that leads to a boat slip, he would start freaking out and say that the brakes are out, and the car was just careening into the lake, and everyone's panicking, and then it would go into the lake, and then he'd be like, oh yeah, my car's also a boat, and they'd drive off just to mess with people. LBJ is an interesting character. The key to all of this is Vietnam. We've mentioned Vietnam under Kennedy. It's starting there. It starts really under Eisenhower, but the earliest bit is in Kennedy, and LBJ is the one where it all lands. So refreshing. Since 1954, North and South Vietnam have been divided. North Vietnam is communist, South Vietnam is capitalist. South Vietnam's leader, Diem, is not a good guy, losing lots and lots of support. And eventually he is assassinated in 1963. So as Kennedy is pulling support away, the South Vietnamese people are fighting against their own government. It's not good. So South Vietnam is not having a lot of success as a nation. Kennedy starts by sending 16,000 military advisors. The advisors are U.S. soldiers, and we use that as a euphemism throughout. The U.S. soldiers fighting over there thought that was hilarious. being called advisors in a war that wasn't actually a war. There was no commitment, no declaration of war by Congress. It all escalates, and that's the key term, escalating, in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. North Vietnam attacks a U.S. Navy ship, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolves, which are passed in Congress, allow Johnson to send more and more and more soldiers, and you can see the troop numbers there at the right. It escalates very quickly to over 500,000 Americans over in Vietnam. We begin carpet bombing North Vietnam using bombers, the asymmetrical warfare, and we'll talk more and more about that. It didn't matter how much we threw at them, it didn't seem to change the outcome. The guy who is the architect of all of this, the person who really is the key figure behind the scenes of domino theory, of containment, of modern U.S. foreign policy, is Robert McNamara. He is Secretary of Defense during the biggest parts of this, and he is remembered as the guy who created the Vietnam War. So let's watch a brief clip here about his life.
We have a death to report tonight, one of the architects, maybe the principal architect of the Vietnam War. Robert S. McNamara was a man of extraordinary accomplishment. As head of the World Bank, he worked to eradicate hunger. He was called the conscience of the West. And before coming to Washington, he had modernized the Ford Motor Company, pulling the plug on the ill-fated Edsel. But all of it, everything, is overshadowed by Vietnam.
I've asked Robert McNamara to assume the responsibilities of Secretary of Defense.
For 7 years under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, McNamara directed the escalation of our commitment in Vietnam. He was so enmeshed in the conflict that by 1964, people were calling it McNamara's War.
And our firepower advantage is immense. Why shouldn't we expect to achieve a military advantage?
But in private, it's been learned McNamara came to have serious doubts that the U.S. could win in Vietnam. After he expressed them to President Johnson, he was given the Medal of Freedom and shown the door. Indeed, McNamara spent the rest of his life agonizing over the war. It seemed to haunt him.
We were wrong. Terribly wrong. And we owe it to future generations to explain why.
McNamara continued his public mea culpa in Errol Morris's Oscar-winning documentary, The Fog of War.
Any military commander who is honest with himself or with those he's speaking to will admit that he has made mistakes in the application of military power. He's killed people unnecessarily, his own troops or other troops, through mistakes, through errors of judgment.
Robert McNamara was 93 years old.
So that's Robert McNamara, generally remembered as that guy. Now, the thing with the Vietnam War, it is a very different war from what we're used to. It's asymmetrical. That we are fighting a guerrilla war, and for the first time, really, we are not the little guys, the underdogs, the ones fighting against some big overwhelming force. Neither is this army versus army. This is not something placed on equal footing. This is fighting against an enemy you never get to see. This is fighting against an enemy that you don't know how many you've killed, if you've killed them. You might wound them, and then they go off back into the jungles. And did they live? Did they die? You don't know. It also is, for the first time, we're really fighting an ideology rather than an army. That you go into villages and you take out people who have been working with North Vietnam. You take out communists. And the next day, there's more. And part of that problem is that, if you kill a guy because he's a communist helping North Vietnam, what do you think his family suddenly thinks of the Americans who killed, say, their father? Sure, they're not going to ignore that. Okay, yeah, he was fighting for North Vietnam, so obviously they were right in killing him. That's just not how that works. So every time the Americans went and killed and cleared out things, they only made the next generation. They only made more. By killing people, you don't win hearts and minds. You don't win the population to help you. It was a very different war, and the The videos I'm including, which I had to cut out of the presentation itself, will certainly help illustrate that. Things that were shown on television back in the 1960s of how this war was being fought. Vietnam is just very different, and in fighting an ideology, you get some odd thoughts, and one line that sums up so much of it, that it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. How little it made sense was obvious then as it is today, and yet that's what it was. That there were so many communists that, well, they just started wiping. Every time they went back, there were more communists, so they destroyed the town to make sure the communists couldn't go back there. But what happens to all the survivors? Well, they're not going to be on the side of the capitalists. I'll let Lyndon Johnson further explain this.
This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. Some citizens of South Vietnam, at times with understandable grievances, have joined in the attack on their own government. But we must not let this mask the central fact that this is really war. It is guided by North Vietnam, and it is spurred by Communist China. Its goal is to conquer the South, to defeat American power, and to extend the Asiatic dominion of communism. And there are great stakes in the balance. Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot by themselves and alone resist the growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. Our power, therefore, is a very vital shield. If we are driven from the field in Vietnam, then no nation can ever again have the same confidence in American promise or in American protection. In each land, the forces of independence would be considerably weakened. And an Asia so threatened by communist domination would certainly imperil the security of the United States itself. Of history.
You can see a lot of domino theory in there. You can see a lot of containment, that we need to help Vietnam in order to help America, so that in the future that all of that stuff works. So again, Vietnam is a different kind of war, guerrilla fighting, and this time we are the big guys that they hit and run. The primary enemy is not North Vietnam's army. I mean, yes, they are an enemy, but they are not the key factor in this. The key factor is the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is a communist people's army. These are civilians who have decided to join the communists to fight this war asymmetrically, using bombs, using booby traps. It's rough. And these are people that you really don't get to see. By day, they're average civilians. At night, they slip out and become the enemy. They could be anyone, and that's not something we're used to. The Viet Cong, or VC, or sometimes called Charlie, because, well, if you call them VC and then you use the NATO alphabet, Victor Charlie, so you'll hear, it talks about the VC, about Charlie, etc. That's all the Viet Cong People's Army, and they specialized in night warfare and traps. And I meant to talk about this a bit when we had the pictures up. Traps were a key part of the Vietnam War and adds to the horror of the whole thing. Simple things like punji pits, where you dig a pit and you put sharpened bamboo stakes into it, and then you cover it up with leaves. Soldier steps on the leaves, they fall through and impale their feet on the punji sticks, the bamboo sticks. And what makes it even more diabolical is, for a lot of these things, and it's mentioned in one of the videos, you smear the bamboo stakes in manure, so that when they do cause an injury, even if it's a light injury, it causes infection. And the Vietnamese realized very quickly that you don't need to kill that killing an American soldier was less of a problem for the American army than wounding an American soldier. You kill an American soldier, that's one person off the battlefield. You wound an American soldier, and now his buddies have to carry him along. You end up neutralizing 2, 3, even 4 Americans by wounding a soldier, and they use that to their advantage. What the Viet Cong also like to use are garbage against us. So with a grenade, a typical pineapple grenade has a thing called a spoon on it, that little handle thing on it. And while you're holding the grenade, you hold that handle down, the grenade will not go off in your hand. You can pull the pin and hold it indefinitely as long as that handle is down. As soon as you let go, that handle springs off, and that starts the countdown of the grenade. That's called a spoon. So what the Viet Cong would do is take American garbage. You take an empty can, you slide that pineapple grenade in there, you pull the pin, and the can holds that spoon down from ejecting and starting the countdown. You tie a string from that grenade across, and you make it a tripwire. And if someone crosses that tripwire, they pull the grenade out of the can, the spoon flies off, and off starts the grenade. You never see any of it. In a dense jungle, how are you going to see a tripwire? All sorts of ridiculous traps that made it very, very dangerous for Americans. This all is the frustration of how do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you fight an enemy that's a friend during the day? How do you fight this kind of war? It just really didn't make sense to us. So we resorted to some very terrible things, and one of the videos I include is about Agent Orange. Agent Orange, which is invented by the Monsanto company, and if you know, if you follow any environmentalism, you'll probably know who Monsanto is. It is a defoliant and herbicide meant to rip the leaves off trees and kill plants in the jungle. The hope being that without the jungle, the Viet Cong doesn't have the cover to fight, and therefore we have a more even fight. Well, in order to kill all these trees, all these plants, right, it's herbicide, it's meant to wipe out all plants. It's also a lot of toxic chemicals that they didn't really think about back then. And so you'll see even in the video that this stuff was never used with any kind of protective gear. It was simply sprayed throughout. And Vietnam veterans had all sorts of cancers and terrible afflictions after the war. And it took a very long time to prove that it was Monsanto's Agent Orange. That it took a very long time to convince the government that, yeah, this is a problem. This is why it happened, and we deserve to be compensated. We deserve to have health care for this that you forced us to use. And even then, it was begrudging by all parties involved. What's worse is the ongoing birth defects caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. It is absolutely heartbreaking to see the children who have these terrible deformities. This chemical has wreaked generations of terrible, terrible things on the Vietnamese people. And because we lost the war, we just generally ignored it. Only recently, President George W. Bush first mentioned any kind of culpability in any of this, and it is only starting that we're admitting that, oh yeah, hey, maybe we should help Vietnam. Do a Google image search of Agent Orange, and you will see things that are so tragic, and it's a legacy that we have not dealt with at all. The other bit is napalm. Napalm is a jellied gasoline mixture. It was invented at the end of World War II. It was used extensively in Korea, but it really gets to be well known in Vietnam. It was used in bombs drops. You can see there. It was used in flamethrowers, that's the boat at the bottom using a flamethrower jet of napalm. It sticks to the skin in ways that you just simply cannot remove it with anything. Water does not dent it, and it burns between 1,500 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is horrific if you get any of this on you or near you. The heat alone nearby will kill you. And at the bottom right, We see the result of a napalm attack, one of the most famous photos of the war, as these poor villagers flee this napalm attack. It's absolutely horrific. Only beginning in 1980, I believe, it was listed as something you shouldn't do on international war crimes. Generally not something we use much today, though I think it's still in the U.S. arsenal. But what people saw mostly were the death tolls. They saw the caskets. They saw kids drafted out of high school. As soon as you graduate, off they went. You see the kids drafted, and then they're off to war, and then you see them come back like this. This is what the public saw. They saw failure. They saw high death tolls. They saw the caskets. And this is why we got major protest from so many against the Vietnam War. That this became a major cultural issue between young people who felt that this was wrong, people who were chanting outside the White House, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Versus the conservative hardline who's like, this is a war, you've been drafted, you do what your government says. We really see the beginnings of conservatism and liberalism, and they started off pretty extreme. This did not start as anything that slowly evolved or escalated. This was hippies versus the people you expect from the 1950s, the standard 50s nerd. I don't know what to call it. A person in a button down and a tie. You'll see some of them in the video. But perhaps most tragic were the veterans who were fighting back, because, well, veterans have a special place in our society, and as they should. And you expect the veterans to talk highly about what they did. But unlike World War II and even Korea, Vietnam didn't really produce heroes. It produced a lot of people with PTSDs on par with the shellings of the trenches, and put that on top of the frustration that there were no big victories like you'd even see in World War I, that you would see some success. It just didn't happen in Vietnam. It's just more and more frustration.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
Kennedy's idealistic pledge pulls U.S. forces into a distant corner of Southeast Asia, Vietnam. Following through on JFK's call for patriotic service and sacrifice falls to his successor, Lyndon Johnson.
I have today ordered to increase our active fighting forces by raising the monthly draft call from 17,000 to 35,000.
America's leaders commit the nation to war. The American people rally behind their president.
Public opinion was behind the war. The general consensus was, we're at war, more people needed to fight the war on our behalf, and therefore the draft is the instrument for that, and that's the way it is.
Communism is the enemy, not just the North Vietnamese. And if Americans need an ideal to fight for, Johnson thinks big. The fate of the free world.
Now, America wins the wars that she undertakes, make no mistake about it. And we have declared war on tyranny and aggression. If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
While overwhelming majorities support sending troops to Vietnam, a small faction take an unpopular stand against war and the draft.
We're losing 200 a day, maybe more. And these pumps here against the United States Army, United States government, that's what you call anarchy and treason going against the United States government.
And
If you were opposed to the war in Vietnam, they thought you were helping unpatriotic and cowardly draft dodgers.
Gradually, the fledgling anti-war movement finds its voice in resistance to the draft.
People are trying to find ways to open up the dialogue on Vietnam that has been missing on the street level.
All of our generation was immediately plunged into the news that we were going to be drafted. And so you've got a lot of young people against this general drift to war. And the draft was the message that you couldn't escape because you had a number. And nothing gets your attention like that number.
William H. Carroll. Silver Star, the third highest medal in the country. It doesn't mean anything. Bob Smeal died for these medals. Lieutenant Pomerol died so I got a medal. Sergeant John died so I got a medal. I got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 Air Medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
You can see the emotion of a veteran throwing back their medals to the White House. It's an odd thing to see, to even think about. Do you think of the heroes of World War II and how everyone came back and talked? To this day, if you see a World War II vet or a Korea vet wearing a hat, absolutely talk to them. They love to talk. They love to tell you what their experience was. Every time I see a World War II vet, I go out of my way to talk when I see one. Vietnam vets are not that way. They just aren't. Even my uncle, he is a Marine. He never retired from the Marines. He was a Marine machine gunner in Vietnam, and only recently have I gotten any stories out of them. And even then, they're sad and they're tragic, and it's not pretty. It's a very different war from the kind of glory we're used to talking about. There is a lot with music and the influence of Vietnam, a little bit for, mostly against, mostly in protest, a golden age of music, and I'll do that once we get to more required assignments. The shame of it all is that Johnson was a very great domestic thinker. He was the perfect vice president to JFK because JFK was all about international and Johnson is all about domestic, and they really could tag team that well. And then when Kennedy is assassinated and Johnson is thrust into the limelight, he wants to focus on his domestic issues, but he can't, and it's all overshadowed by Vietnam. But some huge things happen under Johnson, and he never gets the credit he's deserved because Vietnam is so much bigger. So again, I still have a separate civil rights video, but two of the most key pieces of legislation in the civil rights movement happen under Lyndon Johnson, and in large part because of Lyndon. Well, I won't say because of Lyndon, but he's certainly on board and certainly helping facilitate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, where you cannot discriminate legally based on race, color, or creed, and things like jobs and such like that. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 strips away a lot of things like literacy tests and poll taxes and stuff like that will later be solidified with a constitutional amendment, I think, for the poll tax. And we also see the end to the quota system. That ridiculous 2% based on the 1890 census thing was going on all the way through into the 1960s. The Immigration Act of 1965 finally ends what the National Origins Act of 1924 had started, and we get to modern immigration policy. Other things that happen, Johnson's whole policy is called the Great Society. You hear Great Society, that is Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the centerpiece of that was the war on poverty, taking a page out of FDR's book, creating Jobs Corps, work training programs, community action programs, funds for farmers, two huge things in Medicare, which is medical guarantees for the elderly. It's not perfect, but it's something. and Medicaid, which are medical guarantees for the poor, are signed under Lyndon Johnson. Those are his policies, Medicare and Medicaid, that we still are. And we're talking about Medicare for all right now. Neither of those programs are perfect or ideal, but maybe they would have been if Johnson had been given the opportunity to focus on that rather than the international issues. Head Start and preschool programs start under LBJ. If you went to preschool, thank Lyndon Johnson. HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965, establishes low-income housing and tries to make a dent in our homeless problem. Again, not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And the Consumer Protection Safety Commission, anytime you hear about recalls from the government, that's because of Lyndon Johnson. All of these great things happened under LBJ, and it's all ignored because of how awful Vietnam was. And really, Vietnam took a tremendous turn under Johnson. January 1968, we get the Tet Offensive, which some have called the turning point of the war. I don't know if anything is that clear. But the Viet Cong launch a series of surprise attacks during Lunar New Year, or Tet. And they strike over 100 villages and the U.S. Embassy. They are looking for tremendous, large-scale attacks in order to drive off the Americans. And in a very roundabout, long-term way, it works. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, starts going house to house to execute anyone connected to the U.S. And so we turn up the heat. 58,000 North Vietnamese killed, 4,000 Americans, 14,000 South Vietnamese are killed. And though the numbers match up very much where it's much worse for North Vietnam, the difference is that America was watching at home on television. We'll get back to that, because one other thing that happens in another video I have, because this is a big deal, is the My Lai massacre. This massacre and murder of Vietnamese civilians by American soldiers in My Lai, the village of My Lai, in March of 1968. Over 500 civilians were killed by Americans. Many were raped and tortured by Americans. It was only stopped because a U.S. helicopter pilot landed in the middle of the field that was a firing squad between the American soldiers who were about to do the shooting and the Vietnamese civilians who were about to be shot, and that helicopter pilot refused to move. This was all covered up and ignored. Some stories leaked out, and some people wrote letters, and that was ignored, and eventually a journalist uncovered the whole thing. And then there were some investigations, and some light punishments were handed out to these officers who ordered these massacres. This is a great stain on America's legacy, that this is something terrible, this frustration that boiled over to war crimes, actual war crimes committed by Americans, and we just didn't talk enough about it. No one said at the time about the parallels between Vietnam and the Philippines. The Philippine insurrection really was not taught in school back then. It's still barely taught in school. But I've read from multiple scholars and veterans of Vietnam that had we learned what we did in the Philippines, we might have seen that the same thing was happening in Vietnam and stopped it or changed it. There's a lot of parallels there. All of this is being shown on television. 90% of the U.S. evening news during the 3 months of the Tet Offensive is devoted to the Vietnam War. This is what the news story of the day was. It's like Corona now. And 50 million Americans tuned in every single night to watch the evening news. And there was no government censorship like in World War II. So you see the front lines, you see the bodies in the streets, you see the wounded soldiers being carted off. The picture on the right is another extremely famous photo of the war. The man holding the gun is the head of police forces for South Vietnam. And they were taking a tour with him, just a standard press tour, walking around, seeing what he's doing, it'd be a basic news story. And in the middle of this basic news story, they brought a North Korean supporter to him, and the guy shot him on television, just pulled out a gun and ended him. And it's moments like this where people are watching at home. Vietnam, all of the protest starts to make more and more sense, that how wrong this is, and the support drifts away. And eventually we realize that this all has to end. Lyndon Johnson knows he can't stop it, and well, I guess it's a bit of spoilers here. We'll talk about it more under Nixon, but we will leave Vietnam 1973. North Vietnam wins the war, and Vietnam is united in 1975, and as it is to this day, a communist nation in Southeast Asia. The history of it is thoroughly conflicted. There's a history of controversial decisions and how to memorialize it, and it's why it hasn't really been taught well in schools at any point. We're not ready to deal with it. But Lyndon Johnson in 1968 says, "I'm not going to run for re-election."
Under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
It's odd when you see a sitting president decide not to run for office. So 1968 is considered a very volatile year. Some say it's a very bad year. I mean, as far as unrest, as far as people protesting and fighting and all of that, sure, you can certainly say it that way. It looked, while 2020 is certainly shaping up to be in the running for worst years in U.S. history, 1968 might be number one. I mean, you got 1929 with the stock market crash, start of the Great Depression. Sure, okay. You start think 1861. Yeah, obviously pretty bad. 1812, White House burned. 1968 is in that mix. It starts with the Tet Offensive in January. We've talked about that. In March, students in East LA walk out of their high school, something that's truly unprecedented at that point. Mexican-American students lead a walkout for better educational opportunities. There would be major reforms that come out of this, but certainly not without a whole bunch of controversy and protest. In March, Lyndon Johnson announces he won't run for a second term, which leads a big gap in leadership. Who's going to step up in the Democrats? Richard Nixon is eyeing up as the Republican nominee. In April, and again, this will be touched on. This will be talked about in the civil rights video. Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. He was protesting or speaking to protest to poor workers who it was garbage men protesting for better wages, and he was assassinated by James Earl Ray. Very tragic. This leads to race riots in Chicago, New York, in Washington, and other cities that cause tremendous damage, and is a cry of how could their leader, who had done so much good for so much of peaceful protest, insisted always peaceful protest, and yet he's killed with violence. Shortly thereafter, Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, he was in JFK's cabinet. Just generally seen as a very nice guy, a good guy, someone who was doing good things and was just very pure and a chance at reigniting the hope that JFK had put in so many young Americans. And he was gunned down by Sirhan Sirhan for really hard to grasp ideas, and that was a death of innocence for so many young people here in the United States. In August, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, and there were riots between biker gangs and then the police. The National Guard was called in to put it all down. Very violent, and certainly hurt the Democrats' chances, which leads to Richard Nixon winning the election. You get the outcry around in October, the Black Power movement. The picture at the right is Black Power was a more violent aspect to the civil rights movement of saying that no, we have to do something, have to be active. The counterpoint to Dr. King, more of the Malcolm X side of things, where pushing for reform by force. And this salute at the Olympic Games in Mexico City made tremendous waves in the United States. Look, you guys have seen what Colin Kaepernick did as far as outcry. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. But 1968 does end on a high note, and really probably the only really good thing you can say about the year is that Apollo 8 sends the first men to see the far side of the moon, and they send back a picture that sums up the Earth. So like in so many of my videos, I am going to try and end a bit more positively by looking at the space program. So let's rewind a little bit and hit a few key points on our way to Apollo 8. So the first woman in space, I want to point out, was by the Soviets. That we like to talk about Sally Ride, first American woman in space. Well, that's it. She's the first American woman, or first female astronaut. Well, there was a cosmonaut way earlier in 1963. Valentina Tereshkova flew on the 6th ever space mission for the Soviets. A woman in space well before Sally Ride did it in 1986. So we like to talk about equality and great things. And, well, the Soviets did it well before. Fun fact, the President Putin just less than a month ago, a couple weeks ago, it was reset on his number of terms so that he can, in theory, be president for the rest of his life. And that bill was put into the Russian parliament by Representative Valentina Tereshkova. That she's the one who gave that proposition, or was chosen to give that proposition. And so that is a huge footnote on her legacy. She's still around and kicking and representing Russians. We get the first time an astronaut, or in this case a cosmonaut, could leave the spacecraft. The first extravehicular activity, or spacewalk, happened in 1965 with Alexei Leonov. And you can see him there down in the corner, and the paintings that are with him are by Leonov. In his retirement, he became an artist, and he has really dedicated to painting the beauty that he saw when he was outside his spacecraft. It's really kind of something special to watch. The first American spacewalk would happen just a few months later. Ed White would spacewalk in Gemini 4, a spacecraft meant for 2 people. And fun fact, James McDivitt, the other guy in the spacecraft, saw a UFO while there, and no one's really been able to explain it. So, have fun with that. Let's take a look at a quick video about this.
G's, you're really being pushed into the seat, and all of a sudden it stops. You're floating. It's a lot of fun.
The crew went through the preparation process. They reported we were ready. I had a tracking station make sure that all of the safety criteria had been met, and this was now okay to open up the hatch.
Okay, we're giving you a go for your EVA at this time.
Okay.
Roger, flight, let's go. Okay.
After we got the hatch open, Ed stood up in the seat and got ready to go, and we cleared him to go, and then he took and pushed off from the seat.
Okay, my feet are out. I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
Ed White,
is flying at 17,000 miles per hour, 200 miles above the Earth.
Okay, I'm out.
If the spacesuit fails, the difference in pressure will kill him instantly. If the lifeline fails, he'll literally be lost in space.
The only thing to do would be to disconnect them and let them float around out there. I mean, it was, these are things that's in everybody's mind. We don't have a plan. We don't have a checklist on how you kill your best friend.
As White floats in space, a glove drifts out of the capsule.
Looks like a thermal glove, Jim.
I don't even know whose glove it was. I don't know whether it was his or mine.
I feel like $1 million.
Today, those pictures are a classic. They're still overpowering today to realize, number one, it's been done, and that we did it. It blew me away.
This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous.
So the newest spacecraft is the Apollo. You can see Mercury is the one-man spacecraft at the bottom of the diagram at the right. The Gemini is a two-man spacecraft to test all the things happening. And then Apollo includes the lunar lander. This is how we get to the moon. But it started off with a tragedy. Apollo 1 was a test on the launch pad to test ahead of time the countdown. It was a basic practice run. And in this practice run, the spacecraft was pressured with 100% oxygen, which is ludicrously flammable. But what it had been done in all space flights up to that point, the atmosphere has about 21% oxygen. Somewhere in 15 miles of wiring, a spark happened in the spacecraft. And this spark glowed, and within 15 seconds, it erupted into a massive fireball that first consumed all that oxygen. The astronauts actually suffocated, asphyxiated with lack of oxygen before the burning even started. The hatches were too hard to remove. No one had expected any kind of danger to this test. And it cost the lives of Ed White, who you just saw walking in space, Gus Grissom, the second American in space, and Roger Chaffee, who was a rookie astronaut who had taken many of the photos that we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Apollo 1 starts a major investigation, and you get a lot of astronauts talking about how important it is that yes, there are absolutely risks, but you have to know that going into it, and you have to know that the exploration is never something that's easy, nor is it ever something that's safe, or else it wouldn't be worth doing. And so that they have to continue. And this changes NASA's air of invincibility and really shifts things so that it can be the very methodical NASA that we see up to this day. The Soviets introduced their own three-man spacecraft at this time. They are still using them. The Soyuz is the lifeline of the International Space Station to this day. You can see two of them docked there. It's how we get to the space station even today. With the American disaster, the Soviets have their own disaster at Nedelin. The N-1 rocket, which you can see at the side there, the Soviet moon rocket, explodes in a terrible disaster that kills between 90 and 200 people. I mean, these are Soviet numbers. We'll never really know the true toll, but it went off like multiple Hiroshima bombs on the launch pad. The reason why the Soviets did not reach the moon, and we did, was the size of rocket engines. The Soviets couldn't make ones that were big enough, and trying to make it so all of those rockets balance at even amounts of thrusts was simply impossible. And so we got to the moon thanks to Wernher von Braun and his abilities. And now both space programs have hit a major disaster, have hit a major stumbling block. The question is, who gets up first? Thanks to the Saturn V rocket, developed by former Nazi V-2 rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, we build the largest rocket ever created, 363 feet tall, so powerful that when it launched, its first test launch, it registered as an earthquake 1,000 miles away. That, you know, from Cape Canaveral in Florida to Denver. Denver is what registered a small earthquake. That's how powerful this thing was. This is the rocket that takes us to the moon. And so in December 1968, Apollo 8 was supposed to be a routine in-Earth flight check. And at the last second, they hear that the Soviets are about to go orbit the moon. So Apollo 8's flight plan is changed so that it will orbit the moon first. And they will actually be orbiting the moon December 24th and 25th of 1968. And the 3 astronauts will be doing a live broadcast on Christmas Eve. And they decide to read the Genesis creation story from the Bible, which is obviously Christian creation story. It is the Jewish creation story, and the Islamic Christian creation story is very much based in it. You know, that the Torah is the beginning of so much. So it really struck a chord. But the most important thing that comes out of this is this photo, Earthrise. This photo was not something they expected to take. It was not something that was on the plan, but the astronauts looked out the window and saw this. They saw Earth as it really is in the universe, a tiny blue marble among infinite blackness. And that seeing the Earth this way, without the countries drawn off like we see on a globe, it changes perspective so much that we get the start of the environmental movement right after this. Clean air, clean water, Doctors Without Borders. The ideas of international organizations, get so much bigger. That we went to the moon and we discovered the Earth is really a key thought. And the only good high note that could end a year like 1968. So there's a number of companion videos. Make sure you watch those if you haven't been watching them throughout. I have one on Apollo 8 and this photo. So make sure you watch. I hope that you're watching. I hope that you're preparing for the exam, because this is going to be something completely different. And if you're not ready with the knowledge, you're taking a risk. So with that, thank you all for listening and watching. And I hope you stay safe and stay home and stay healthy.